Well, criticism is mounting against Russia's air campaign in Syria. Several countries, including the US, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, are urging Russia to stop targeting Syrian opposition groups and civilians. Russia says it's only been hitting ISIS targets in the nearly 20 airstrikes so far. US President Barack Obama says Russia's involvement in Syria will only cause more bloodshed in the war-torn country.
We are not going to cooperate with a Russian campaign to simply try to destroy anybody who is disgusted and fed up with Mr. Assad's behavior. Keep in mind also from a practical perspective, the moderate opposition in Syria is one that, if we're ever going to have a political transition, we need. And the Russian policy is driving those folks underground or creating a situation in which they are decapacitated, and it's only strengthening ISIL.
Meanwhile, Russia remains unfazed by foreign criticism of its military action and says it did not carry out any strikes against civilians. Well, Phil Black is covering this story for us from Moscow, and senior international correspondent Ben Wedeman is in Beirut, Lebanon. Thanks very much for joining us. Let's start with Phil. Phil, the US-led coalition partners are reaching out to Russia, including French President Francois Hollande. What is it going to take for Russia and Iran to work with the US-led coalition, or do they simply have no interest in doing that?
Well, I think that if you accept the analysis of the United States and its coalition partners, at the moment the Russian policy is in no way compatible with that of theirs, really, according to President Obama, as you just heard there, and other countries, including the French president, who said he gave this message to Vladimir Putin directly yesterday. They believe that Russia is only striking, and certainly focused on striking, those groups which are presenting an immediate threat to the regime of President Bashar al-Assad and his forces in Syria. And those groups do not really include ISIS at the moment. They believe that Russia is only targeting those groups which are challenging the Syrian regime, and that, as a result, is only causing civilian casualties. But as you touched on there, Russia denies that, insists that it is only going after what it describes as terrorist groups. And in fact, with every day that passes, and they give their long list of targets that the Russian military claims to have hit, it insists that each group, each target, a facility and so forth, is owned and operated by ISIS itself, Lynda.
And let's just bring in Ben for now. Stay with us, Phil. Ben, if you can just give us some more perspective on the exact targets. Clearly, as Phil was saying, and as we've heard from all parties involved, Russia claims they're targeting ISIS, but the US-led coalition claimed that that Russia's actually going after the rebels fighting ISIS. What's your reading? What's your understanding of what's going on?
Well, we heard just this morning, Lynda, from the British Defense Minister, who says that only 1 in 5 of the targets being struck by Russian aircraft actually belongs to ISIS. And if you look at the pattern of the airstrikes, many of them are focused around targets in western Syria, around Homs, Hama, and in Idlib province, where there are rebels operating, of course, some of them part of this Jaish al-Ahrar, which Jaish al-Islam, which is a coalition of a variety of groups, including, for instance, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate within Syria. But for instance, overnight, we understand there was a series of strikes around Raqqa to the north and the west of it, which in fact belong to ISIS. But by and large, it does appear that the strikes are focusing on other groups rather than ISIS. And there's an interesting situation developing in Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria. That's a city where there's a small government enclave still holding out, and there's an offensive by ISIS in that area to take the airport, the military airport. But this isn't an area where the US-led coalition aircraft normally operate. And it'll be interesting to see if the Russians are going to come to the aid of regime forces in Deir ez-Zor or leave them be and, in fact, risk the possibility of losing a very important final outpost for the regime in eastern Syria. So it really is a complicated situation, and we understand that the U.S. and Russia are trying to deconflict their operations in Syria, but Deir ez-Zor is going to be a test to see whether they can actually do that.
Deconflict is the word that it keeps being used, but of course President Obama has said that he's worried that Russia's involvement and Russia and Iran building up the Assad regime will actually will escalate the conflict. What's your assessment, Ben?
Well, you know, when you're fighting against ISIS, for instance, it's important to keep in mind their apocalyptic vision of this conflict. Keep in mind, for instance, that Al-Qaeda began its fight in Afghanistan against the Russians for jihadis, for instance, members of ISIS. This is sort of their dream come true, to be fighting against the United States, to be fighting against Russia in what they see as the final battle. So rather than being terrified, if you look on social media, many of them seem to be delighted by the fact the Russians are involved. Now, for instance, we see a leader from Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, is offering jihadis a 2 million Syrian lira, that's about $9,000 reward for the capture of Russian soldiers. They are licking their lips at this opportunity. So definitely it will galvanize even further those who support this jihad, this holy war in Syria. And it'll be interesting to see, for instance, the reaction of Salafis, jihadis around the Muslim world to this intervention, now direct intervention by Russia in this seemingly endless conflict. Lynda?
It's a very good point, Ben. And just finally to Phil, Russia's economy is of course struggling and it has huge trade ties with Syria. How is this military move by Moscow being viewed by the Russian people?
Yeah, it's mixed, Lynda, really. The support is far from overwhelming. An independent poll taken just before the Russian military action began in earnest showed that only about 40% of people support Russian policies in Syria. Now, that is tempered somewhat by Vladimir Putin's approval ratings, which still soar at around 80% and have done so consistently for a long time now. But he can't take that for granted because, as you mentioned, the economy here is in real trouble. It's not going anywhere. The country continues to suffer under economic sanctions that have been imposed because of its actions and policies in Ukraine. The oil price has dropped well below what it needs for this country to balance its books, and the currency is much depleted. So all of these factors really influence the quality of life for Russians here. They have been driven to support their government by a nationalistic fervour, largely inspired by the policies in Ukraine and so forth. But it'll be interesting to see just what the ongoing reaction is to the actions in Syria, as they are continued to be championed by Russian state media with round-the-clock images of Russian jets flying sorties, combat video of the targets being struck, and so forth. Lynda.
Yeah, we'll see if those opinions there change. Phil Black in Moscow and Ben Wedeman in Beirut. Thank you both, gentlemen. We appreciate it.